They said he drowned while duck hunting, that his body had been swallowed by alligators, and that it was nothing more than a freak accident. Tragic, yes, but not suspicious. This is the story of Mike Williams, who vanished without a trace, and a mother who refused to let her son's name be buried. Welcome back to Chilling Fireside Stories, where I tell true crime stories with the utmost care and respect for the victims and bearable for my community. If you haven't already, please subscribe. It truly helps me continue bringing these important stories to you. These cases deserve to be remembered. Now, settle in and let's begin. Mike Williams was the kind of person people remember for all the right reasons. He was kind, hardworking, and dependable. On the surface, his life looked picture-perfect: loving family, successful career, and a high school sweetheart turned wife. But behind that polished image was a tragedy that went unsolved for nearly 20 years. Born Jerry Michael Williams in Tallahassee, Florida. From a young age, he understood responsibility. He'd wake up at 3 a.m. to stock shelves at the local supermarket, helping his family make ends meet, always with a good attitude, never complaining. His parents, Jerry and Cheryl, believed deeply in education and sent Mike and his older brother Nick to North Florida Christian School. That's where Mike really began to shine. He was the classic all-American kid, football player, class president, member of Key Club, and popular for all the right reasons. Smart, kind, athletic, and grounded. And then there was Denise Merrill, the cheerleader who stole his heart. Their love story played out like something from a teen romance. Football star meets cheerleader, and they fall in love. In high school, he was voted best personality. She was best dressed. To everyone around them, they looked like the perfect match. After high school, Mike and Denise both headed to Florida State University, and their relationship continued to thrive. After graduation, they each stepped into careers they were proud of. Denise became an accountant, and Mike landed a job as a real estate appraiser with the Ketchum Appraisal Group. His work ethic was unmatched. 15-hour days weren't unusual for him. But no matter how busy he was, Mike always made time for Denise. People admired their relationship, some even envied it. They seemed like the perfect couple. And on December 17, 1994, they made it official. Their wedding was filled with joy, and both families were thrilled. His kindness extended beyond his marriage. Mike was thoughtful, selfless, and deeply loyal to his friends, especially Brian Winchester. The two met in high school and were inseparable. Brian also married his high school sweetheart, Kathy, who, like Denise, had been a cheerleader. The four of them were inseparable. Friends so close, they were nicknamed the Rat Pack. Wherever one went, the others weren't far behind. Their lives mirrored each other in uncanny ways. Both couples married in 1994. Mike and Denise had a child, and soon after, Brian and Kathy did too. There's home footage of Mike holding his newborn, absolutely glowing. He talked about wanting another baby and how watching Denise give birth gave him a whole new respect for women. It was a moment that said everything about who he was. But on December 16, 2000, just one day before what should have been Mike and Denise's 6th wedding anniversary, everything changed. Before the sun had even risen, Mike left home to do something he'd loved since he was a teenager: duck hunting. It was meant to be a quick morning trip, just a few hours out on the water before returning home to pack for a romantic anniversary getaway with Denise. But Mike never came back. He vanished without a trace. And what followed was a mystery that would haunt his family for years to come. By early afternoon, Denise began calling friends and family, hoping someone had seen or heard from him. One of the first calls went to Marcus Winchester, Brian's father. And when Marcus heard Mike hadn't returned, he immediately called Brian. Without hesitation, Brian dropped everything and joined his dad to search for Mike. They knew he'd gone to Lake Seminole, about an hour away, so that's where they headed. Others joined in, but it was Brian and Marcus who first spotted Mike's truck and trailer parked near the boat landing. But Mike's boat was missing. Their hearts sank. If the boat was gone but the truck was still there, something had likely gone wrong on the water. They contacted the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, and by 4 p.m., a full-scale search was underway, one of the largest Lake Seminole had ever seen. Search teams combed the area by land, water, and air. Cadaver dogs were brought in. And late that night, Brian and Marcus found Mike's boat. But there was still no sign of Mike himself. Temperatures had dropped sharply, below freezing. If Mike had somehow fallen into the water and made it to shore, the cold alone could have been fatal. Lake Seminole is massive, over 37,000 acres of water and 376 miles of shoreline. This wasn't a small lake you could scan in a day. Searchers had to rely on whatever clues they could find. And the boat offered a few. Inside were 2 life jackets, duck decoys, and Mike's shotgun, still zipped up in its case. The motor was dead, but the gas tank was full. That detail mattered. It suggested that whatever happened fast. Mike hadn't even fired a shot. The working theory was that Mike hit a submerged log or branch, got thrown from the boat, and his waders filled with water, dragging him under before he could escape. It sounded plausible. After all, 79 people had drowned in Lake Seminole before. But something didn't add up. If the boat was moving when Mike was thrown, why was the gas tank still full? Boats don't shut off on their own. For that theory to work, the boat would have had to run out of fuel. And it hadn't. Still, the theory stuck. Searchers spent days combing 5 acres of lake bed, 1 square foot at a time. 10 days into the search, something finally surfaced. A hat. Searchers believed it might belong to Mike. Brian was asked to identify it, and while some sources say he confirmed it was Mike's, others suggest he wasn't entirely sure. The hat was sent off for DNA testing, but no DNA was found. Still, most people assumed it had to be his. And with that, the theory that Mike had drowned in Lake Seminole began to take hold. After all, every single one of the 79 people who had drowned in that lake before had eventually been recovered. So searchers held on to hope. But as the days turned into weeks and no other evidence appeared, that hope began to fade. That's when a new theory emerged. Maybe Mike had been eaten by an alligator. It was Florida after all. Lake Seminole was known for them. From the very beginning, search crews had to be cautious. Alligators lurked in nearly every shadow, and as time dragged on, people clung to whatever explanation they could. A private search firm even filed a report suggesting that alligators had dismembered Mike and stored his remains somewhere unreachable. Many accepted this theory, except for one person, Cheryl Williams. From the very beginning, Cheryl refused to believe her son was in that lake. And she certainly didn't believe he'd been eaten by an alligator. While others were ready to give up, Cheryl was just getting started. She became her son's fiercest advocate, refusing to let his story fade into silence. Unlike others, Cheryl used common sense. She remembered a conversation with Mike where he mentioned that alligators don't eat when it's cold. And on the day he disappeared, temperatures had dropped into the low 20s. Even if Mike had ended up in the water, the alligators wouldn't have been active. When it gets cold, alligators enter a state called brumation. It's similar to hibernation. Their bodies slow down, they stop hunting, they don't store food, and they survive the cold by conserving energy. To back up her instincts, Cheryl reached out to Dr. Matthew Oresco, a respected alligator biologist. He reviewed the case and confirmed what Cheryl already knew. There was no scientific basis for the alligator theory. And even if an alligator had truly gotten to Mike, there should have been something, clothing, remains, a trace. But aside from a hat that couldn't even be confirmed as his and the abandoned boat, there was nothing. No real evidence to support the alligator theory. Cheryl pointed it out and begged people to listen, but no one did. She stood outside churches with signs. She handed out flyers on street corners. She did everything she could to get people to care, but most dismissed her as a grieving mother who couldn't accept the truth. They called it a tragic accident, but she called it unfinished business. Even after the official search ended, 44 days in, Cheryl didn't stop. But someone else did. Mike's wife, Denise. She seemed to accept the drowning theory almost immediately. She moved on quickly, and Cheryl's refusal to do the same reportedly infuriated her. Denise never joined the search. Not once. Even Mike's boss, Clay Ketchum, and his wife went out to the lake that day. When they stopped by Mike and Denise's house afterward, they found her hosting what looked like a holiday party. She told them she was staying home in case she got a call to go to the hospital, but Clay found that odd. She could have gone to the hospital from the lake too. And then came the memorial. Denise pushed for a service on February 11th, despite Cheryl's request to wait. Cheryl felt it was premature. There was no confirmation Mike was dead. The Rush memorial didn't sit right with her, so she took note. She took note of everything. Every inconsistency, every alibi, every shift in tone. Cheryl kept meticulous records, eventually compiling a 27-page report on her son's disappearance. She was running her own investigation, quietly and relentlessly. And 6 months after Mike vanished, something new surfaced. A local fisherman found a pair of waders in Lake Seminole, right near where Mike had disappeared. Divers were called in. Soon, they recovered Mike's jacket, and inside one of its pockets, they found Mike's hunting license, but something was off. If those items had been underwater for 6 months, they should have looked the part, but they didn't. The license was pristine, signatures still visible. The waders weren't slimy. The jacket showed minimal water damage. Even the flashlight they found still worked. It was obvious the items had been planted. But instead of investigating further, authorities clung to the drowning theory. Cheryl saw through it, and she wasn't backing down. She began asking the hardest question of all. If Mike didn't die by accident, then who would want him dead and why? Denise came to mind, but Cheryl struggled to believe it. She'd always thought Mike and Denise had a strong marriage. Mike had a good job, made good money, and above all, he was a devoted husband and father. He adored his daughter. They were even planning to try for a second child. Denise didn't seem like a suspect at first. But then came the moment that changed everything. Just 1 week after Mike's jacket and waders were found, Denise cashed in his 3 life insurance policies, totaling $1.75 million. Now, on one hand, she was a single mother. Her husband was gone. Life insurance exists for that reason. But on the other hand, it was fast. Too fast. Florida law requires a 5-year wait to declare a missing person legally dead. But Denise found a way around that. If a judge grants a death certificate early, the payout can happen sooner. And to get that certificate, certain steps must be taken, like holding a memorial service, which Denise did. Suddenly, Cheryl saw the pieces falling into place. Denise had tried to file for the certificate before, but was denied due to lack of proof. Then, after the jacket and waders were found, the judge approved it. Cheryl couldn't shake the feeling that it was all too convenient. She tried to raise the alarm and begged people to listen. Cheryl wrote a letter to the governor every single day for 9 years. And she never got a response. Law enforcement ignored her, but the media didn't. About a month after the death certificate was issued, a local news station picked up the story. They reported on Mike's suspicious disappearance. It didn't really alert the police, but it did rattle Denise. She called Cheryl and threatened her and told her to stop digging, or she'd cut off access to her granddaughter. And Cheryl, faced with an impossible choice, stood her ground. She wasn't going to stop. Even if it meant sacrificing time with her granddaughter, Cheryl refused to back down, and thank God she didn't, because after years of relentless advocacy, in 2004, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement finally agreed to sit down with her and hear what she had to say about Mike's disappearance. They didn't come into that meeting expecting to take her seriously. Their intention was to appease her, to let her speak, and then move on. But once they actually listened, once they read through the meticulous 27-page report she had compiled, they realized there was far more to this case than a tragic accident on the water. The investigators began to reevaluate everything, and several details immediately stood out. Details that Cheryl had been pointing out for years. The boat's gas tank was full, which contradicted the theory that Mike had been flung from a moving vessel. The timing of the clothing found in the lake seemed suspiciously convenient, especially considering how pristine those items were despite supposedly being submerged for months. And then there was the life insurance situation, which raised more than a few eyebrows. One detail in particular caught their attention. When reviewing the contents of Mike's boat, they noted that 2 life jackets had been found. Cheryl had always insisted that her son rarely, if ever, went boating alone, so the presence of a second life jacket begged the question, Who was it for? The most obvious possibility was Brian Winchester, Mike's lifelong friend and frequent hunting partner. Investigators considered this seriously, but two things initially held them back. First, Brian claimed he had an alibi. He said he was supposed to go hunting with his father-in-law that morning but overslept and stayed home instead, though this couldn't be verified. Second, and perhaps more emotionally complicated, was the question of motive. Could Brian really have done something so horrific to someone who was, by all accounts, like a brother to him? At first, it seemed like a stretch. But then two revelations changed everything. Investigators discovered that Brian Winchester, who worked in insurance, had sold Mike a $1 million life insurance policy just 6 months before Mike disappeared, on top of two existing policies that already totaled $750,000. That alone raised suspicions. But the real turning point came when they learned that Brian and Denise were now romantically involved. Suddenly, the pieces began to fall into place, and the case began to reek of foul play. Then, in 2005, Brian and Denise got married. Their union made everything look worse. It intensified investigators' suspicions, but it also complicated the legal landscape. As husband and wife, Brian and Denise could no longer be compelled to testify against one another, which meant that even if new evidence surfaced, it would be harder to prosecute. By this time, whispers had begun to circulate, rumors and quiet conversations about the couple's possible involvement in Mike's disappearance. But without concrete evidence, they remained free, living their lives as if nothing had happened. It wasn't for lack of effort on the investigators' part. They tried speaking to Brian and Denise separately, hoping one of them might crack, but both stuck to their stories. However, they did manage to gather valuable information from Brian's ex-wife Kathy, who shared two critical details. First, she believed Brian and Denise had been having an affair long before Mike went missing, which added a clear motive to the case. Second, she contradicted Brian's alibi, stating that he had left the house very early on the morning of Mike's disappearance and didn't return until late in the afternoon. And while Kathy's account was compelling and deeply troubling, it still wasn't enough. Law enforcement knew that if they were going to make a case stick, they needed more than suspicion. They needed certainty, and that their best chance would come only when either Brian or Denise cracked under pressure. And between the two, Brian always seemed the more volatile, the one more likely to unravel first. That possibility began to take shape in 2007, when Brian reached out to his ex-wife Kathy, asking to meet. What he didn't know was that Kathy had already begun cooperating with investigators and had agreed to wear a wire during their conversation. The meeting was set outside a McDonald's, but when they arrived, Brian insisted they go to the courthouse instead, wanting to walk through a metal detector to ensure she wasn't recording him. Thankfully, Kathy managed to avoid detection and still engage in conversation, trying to understand why Brian had reached out in the first place. It quickly became clear he was panicking. He wanted to know what time she had told investigators she saw him on the morning Mike disappeared, clearly trying to get her to align her story with his. But Kathy refused to play along. She wouldn't tell him what she'd said, and she certainly wasn't going to protect him. While the conversation didn't yield a confession, it gave investigators something valuable: confirmation that Brian was nervous, that he was watching closely, and that he was far from innocent. Between 2005 and 2012, Brian and Denise continued living in the home that Mike had bought for his family, enjoying the financial security provided by his life insurance policies. Brian even stepped into a fatherly role with Mike's daughter, and Cheryl, who had fought so hard for justice, was forced to watch them live freely, untouched by consequence, while her son remained missing. The emotional toll of that reality is hard to fathom, and yet Cheryl never gave up. By 2012, cracks began to show. Detectives learned that Brian and Denise were discussing separation, citing infidelity and claims that Brian was struggling with sex addiction. But despite the tension, they didn't immediately divorce. Denise was willing to try and salvage the relationship on the condition that Brian move out of the house. That fragile arrangement held for a few years, but by August of 2016, things reached a breaking point. One morning in August 2016, Brian hid in the back seat of Denise's car, waiting for her to leave for work. As she began driving, He slowly emerged from the shadows, pointed a gun at her head, and demanded she keep driving. Denise, terrified, quickly realized that he had brought a tarp and a spray bottle of bleach, items that made his intentions chillingly clear. She knew, without a doubt, that if she didn't find a way to calm him down, he was going to kill her. Thinking fast, Denise pulled into the parking lot of a CVS and began telling Brian everything he wanted to hear and managed to calm him down. Then Brian grabbed the items he had brought, stepped out of the car, and left her unharmed. Denise went straight to the police.
I'll just tell you about what happened today. Okay. So I go out to my car to go to work. I work at FSU. I was calling my sister, and this person starts climbing out of the very back, and I couldn't tell at first who it was, but then immediately I knew who it was, but I was screaming. He, was up and grabbing me, and he pulled my face pretty hard, and he goes, he's cussing, you will turn here, you will turn here, and he pulled out a gun, like a gun, not a hunting gun, but like a gun he would kill someone with, and he put it right here in my ribs. So he was in the back, I guess, hiding, and then when he came out, he came up to right behind me. So like I'm driving, and he's right here. So the gun stayed there the whole time. He finally had let go of the seat, so I was still buckled in, but I was turning, and I was like, what do you want to talk about? So then he was like, you won't answer my text, I had to do this because you won't answer my text or my calls. Please just call the divorce off. I've lost everything, blah, blah, blah. So I ended up, we were probably there, for like, it felt, maybe 45 minutes to an hour. So if their cameras do work, they'll see the whole thing. I would cry some and cry not. It was raining, people would come and go. But I ended up, of course, at the beginning, especially, he was crazed. And then as we were talking, I was just kind of agreeing with whatever he was saying. And I was like, I know that you love me. And he's recently lost his son. His son has decided to move in with, he had joint custody and now he doesn't. And so he said, I've lost my son, I've lost you, I have nothing to live for. And I was like, well, Brian, you're the only one who can change. So I just kept saying, you've got to stop living that way. You've got, you could get us all back if you'll just turn your life around, because he was a Christian at one point. And I was like, if you'll just turn back to the Lord. So the whole time I'm turned this way, I'm buckled in, but he's calm, he's calming down. And so, but the gun's still right there, and I'm just like, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? And he's like, what am I doing? I could tell he was, and I was like, I don't know. I know you want to talk to me, but this is not the way to do it. I know. What have I done? It's like he kind of woke up.
We'll do the injunction. That's the first step, I think. It's a restraining order.
Okay.
It's going to keep him from, if he calls you, once you submit that paperwork, that's a violation.
Okay.
And we're going to follow up on that, okay?
For investigators, this was a turning point. After 15 years of silence, Denise was finally talking, accusing Brian of kidnapping her. It was the moment they'd hoped for, a chance she might reveal the truth about Mike's disappearance. But despite the gun, the threats, the bleach, and the tarp, Denise denied that Brian had ever harmed Mike. Even when asked directly, she claimed he'd never said anything to suggest he was involved.
He was going to kill himself, Denise. He was going to kill you so that you couldn't talk about him later. That is the truth. I've been doing this too long. I've talked to everybody I know over the years for 15 years about how and what we could do. 15 years ago, he walked in and told you he had done something. Didn't he?
No.
Denise.
No.
You have got, this is not going away. He's going to try to stop people from talking about what he did.
I never had any reason to believe that he would do that. He loves the Lord. He was a Christian. That's why I married him. He was doing prison ministry. I was doing prison ministry. Even after everything that he said to me today, I do not believe, no, I don't. And I don't believe he was there to hurt me.
He killed Mike. And he did it for you because he wanted you. And I know that's hard, and I know it hurts. But by God, I'm telling you, that's what happened. How old was Ainsley then?
Baby.
Huh?
A baby.
Not even a year. He didn't care. He killed your husband.
But if he is nuts, that crazy, then again, I can't have an officer live with me 24/7.
He killed Mike. And he buried Mike where no one could ever find him. That is the truth. I'm wondering if he was taking you to the same place today that he buried Mike, because he's done it before. You have to wrap your mind around it, Denise. That is what he has done, and he's willing to do it again.
No, I'm just starting to feel very uncomfortable.
Okay.
But
Well, I've been uncomfortable for a long time because we needed some things on this case.
right.
And we were hoping one day that either Brian or you maybe could fill in some of the gaps there, fill in a piece of the puzzle.
Right. But I guess right now I need to focus on this and what happened this morning, and I want to get this restraining order done by 5 o'clock. And I want me and my daughter to be safe, and that's what I'm focused on.
There's no doubt that Brian's going to be located and put in jail. You know, what if he starts talking about the past, way in the past?
Then he might. I don't know. I have no idea what he's going to say.
Yeah, no idea.
No.
What if he starts talking about? What if he starts talking about
admits
the
it.
disappearance of Mike?
I hope he admits this morning. I hope he admits what he did. If they ask him about Mike, I have no idea. I mean, we'll see.
That same night, Brian Winchester was arrested and charged with kidnapping and aggravated assault with a firearm. He was held without bond in the Leon County Jail after Denise submitted a letter to the judge pleading for her safety, writing that it was either his life or hers, and begging the court to choose hers. Brian did not handle jail well. His cellmate, a man named Wade, later told investigators that Brian had tried to pay him to find someone on the outside who would lie on his behalf. Specifically, Brian wanted someone to falsely claim that Denise had admitted to fabricating the kidnapping. Wade refused to participate and instead came forward, revealing Brian's attempt to manipulate the narrative, proof not of murder, but of desperation and deceit. 16 months after his arrest, Brian finally pled guilty to the charges. While kidnapping and aggravated assault are serious crimes, they don't typically result in a life sentence. But investigators, determined to get him to turn on Denise, made it clear that they were prepared to pursue the harshest penalty possible unless he was willing to cooperate. And he was. In October of 2017, Brian Winchester made a full confession in exchange for full immunity. After 16 years of waiting, investigators finally had the answers they'd been chasing, but the man who had buried Mike Williams would never face charges for his murder. Brian led authorities to Mike's body, buried near the edge of Carr Lake, just north of Tallahassee. The recovery was done in secret, and it was successful. On October 18, 2017, Mike's remains were found, still dressed in the same clothes he wore the day he vanished. Even his wedding ring was still wrapped around the bones of his finger. That discovery alone confirmed what Cheryl had known all along. The clothing found in Lake Seminole had been planted. When Brian appeared in court for sentencing on the kidnapping charges, the public was stunned to learn he had received just 20 years. Denise had begged the judge to keep him behind bars for life, unaware that a deal had already been made behind closed doors. Brian was never going to serve time for the murder. Investigators had wanted Mike's body and closure so badly, they were willing to trade Brian's freedom for Denise's conviction. And Brian's confession gave them everything they needed. In May of 2018, 5 months after Mike's remains were recovered, Denise Williams was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and accessory after the fact. She pled not guilty to all charges, confident that her word against Brian's would be enough to secure an acquittal. After all, he was a confessed murderer, and she had never physically laid a hand on Mike. In December of 2018, nearly 18 years after Mike was killed, Denise stood trial for his murder. The entire case hinged on Brian's testimony. The defense team argued that his word meant nothing, that he had admitted to committing the murder alone, and that Denise had not been present for any of it. Her alleged role was in the planning and orchestration, but there was no physical evidence to prove that. The only thing tying her to the crime was Brian's account, and the defense believed the jury wouldn't trust it. But things didn't go the way they had hoped. Brian's testimony was detailed, emotional, and damning. He admitted that he and Denise had been having an affair for 3 years before Mike's death. He described how it started slowly, how they couldn't stay away from each other, and how, eventually, they decided they wanted to be together permanently. But there was one problem. Denise didn't want a divorce. According to him, Denise feared the shame of divorce more than the consequences of murder. He believed her reluctance stemmed from a mix of pride, religious upbringing, and a deep desire to maintain the image of a perfect life. In her mind, becoming a widow was more acceptable than becoming a divorcee. About a year before Mike's death, Brian and Denise began actively plotting how to make that happen. Their affair had started gradually, two people venting about their spouses, spending more time together, and eventually crossing a line they couldn't uncross. The more they fed into each other's frustrations, the more they convinced themselves that being together was the only way forward. But with Denise unwilling to divorce Mike, their options narrowed, and their conversations turned dark. Brian testified that they considered multiple ways to kill Mike. One of the earliest ideas was to stage a robbery gone wrong, targeting him at work late at night. But they quickly abandoned that plan, knowing it would trigger a full investigation. Instead, they shifted towards something that looked like an accident, something that wouldn't raise suspicion. That's when the boating scenarios began. One plan involved all four of them, Brian, Denise, Mike, and Kathy, going out on the Gulf. The idea was to push Mike and Kathy overboard, let the boat drift or sink, and make it appear as though Denise and Brian had survived a tragic accident. But Brian later admitted he never intended for Kathy to die, and that plan was scrapped. Eventually, they settled on a third option, one that felt familiar, routine, and easy to disguise. Brian would invite Mike on one of their regular hunting trips, make sure he was wearing his waders, and then, at the right moment, push him into the water. Brian explained that they chose December 2000 for two reasons. First, one of Mike's life insurance policies was about to lapse, and he wasn't planning to renew it. Second, Mike and Denise's wedding anniversary was approaching, and they had planned a romantic getaway. Denise didn't want to go. Their daughter was 18 months old, and she and Mike hadn't been intimate since before the baby was born. Mike had made it clear that he expected that to change during the trip, and Denise, still deeply involved with Brian, was determined to avoid that at all costs. So they decided Mike had to die before the anniversary trip. The plan was designed to make it look like Mike had gone hunting alone. Denise's alibi would be that she had stayed home, while Brian's would be that he was out hunting with his father-in-law, a trip he had genuinely planned to take. To ensure no one could contradict his timeline, Brian even slipped his wife, Kathy, a sleeping pill so she wouldn't wake up when he left early that morning. Brian met Mike at a gas station, telling him they were heading to a secret spot, somewhere special for duck hunting. He made sure Mike brought his waders, relying on the long-standing myth among hunters that if you fall into deep water wearing waders, they'll fill up and drag you under. Brian was paranoid about leaving any trace, so he told Mike his phone battery was dead, discouraging any calls that might later show up in phone records.
We were going to go to a secret special spot to go hunting, and that he needed to bring his waders. I was very concerned about the time. Everything had taken longer than what I had anticipated, and I had to be back in town early enough in time to meet my father-in-law for my alibi trip. And so we headed out, and there was a deep area, maybe a couple 100 yards from the landing that we put in. We got to that area that I knew was a deep area, and I don't remember exactly how I got him to stand up, but I don't know if I pretended something was wrong with the motor or the weight in the boat was off or something, but basically stopped the boat and got him to stand up. And when he did, I pushed him into the water.
What happened next?
So he was in the water, and he was like struggling, and the motor of the boat was still running, and I pulled off just a little bit to get kind of away from him so that he couldn't reach back into the boat. And I didn't know it at the time. I didn't know if he was trying to swim, but what I came to find out, or eventually realized, was he was taking the waders and the jacket off. He got those off, and he swam over to one of those stumps and held on to it. And he was panicking, and I was panicking. And none of this was like going well. I thought it was going to go. And I didn't know what to do. He started to yell, and I didn't know how to get out of that situation. And so I had my gun in the boat, and so I loaded my gun, and I ended up circling closer towards him, and he was in the water. And as I passed by, I shot him. I had to find somewhere close, and it was a really grown-up area. And like I said, the lake was almost dry, so the water was down, and I decided to put him down in the lake bed itself, kind of on the edge of the lake, so that eventually when the water came back up, that area would be underwater.
Because of the immunity deal he struck in exchange for his confession, Brian will never face legal consequences for murdering his best friend. Denise's story, however, took a different turn. After a 3-day trial, a jury found her guilty on all charges, and she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Cheryl and for everyone who had waited so long for justice, it was a moment of profound relief. Cheryl had been the lone voice fighting for her son, refusing to let his story be buried, and it's because of her that this day ever came. But even that wasn't the end. In 2019, Denise filed an appeal to overturn her conviction, and she won. After re-examining the case, an appeals court reversed the decisions on 2 of the charges, first-degree murder and accessory after the fact. The charge of conspiracy to commit murder was upheld, so she wasn't let off entirely, but her sentence was reduced to 30 years. At her resentencing in 2020, Mike and Denise's daughter, now grown, spoke directly to the judge. She asked for leniency, saying she didn't believe her mother had anything to do with her father's murder, and expressed concern about the toll prison was taking on Denise's mental and physical health. For Cheryl Williams, Mike's mother, the long fight for justice was both vindicating and heartbreaking. After 17 years, she finally learned the truth and brought her son home for a proper burial. But nothing could undo the betrayal or restore the life that was stolen. The murder of Mike Williams remains a haunting reminder of how greed and deception can destroy lives, and how a mother's unshakable determination can uncover even the darkest truths. Thank you for watching today's tragic story, and until my next video, please look after yourselves and your loved ones.